When an arrogant executive embarks on a guided cave tour in a remote region, he scoffs at the local guide's strict warnings, dismissing them as unnecessary. Ignoring safety rules, he ventures off the marked path, eager to prove his superiority. But deep within the Earth's belly, the air turns heavy, the tunnels shift, and an eerie silence surrounds him up until he realizes he's not alone in the darkness. The private helicopter descended toward the remote village of San Cristobal, its rotor kicking up dust that scattered the local children who had gathered to witness the arrival. Alexander Kent adjusted his Rolex as the craft settled onto the makeshift landing zone, his eyes scanning the primitive surroundings with barely disguised disdain. At 42, the tech executive had conquered Silicon Valley, amassed a fortune of over $300 million, and now collected extreme experiences like others collected art. This obscure cave system in the mountains of Mexico was simply the latest addition to his personal highlight reel. "Mr. Kent, welcome to San Cristobal," the village representative called out as Alexander ducked under the slowing rotors, designer luggage in hand. "I am Pablo. Your guide Miguel is waiting at the visitor center." Alexander nodded without making eye contact, his attention already on his phone, checking the non-existent signal. "Is there Wi-Fi here? I need to confirm my extraction in 3 days." Pablo's smile faltered slightly. "The community center has limited connection. This way, please." The visitor center was a modest stone building with hand-painted signs describing the ancient cave system that had sustained the village's economy for generations. Inside, a lean, weathered man in his 50s stood studying a detailed hand-drawn map of underground passages. Miguel Ortiz had navigated these caves since childhood, following in the footsteps of his father and grandfather before him. "Mr. Kent, this is Miguel, your guide for the Cueva de los Espíritus," Pablo announced. "There is no one who knows these caves better." Miguel extended a calloused hand. "Welcome to our village. I understand you wish to see the deeper chambers. These require significant preparation and respect for safety protocols." Alexander's handshake was brief and dismissive. "I've done Krubera in Georgia and Sen Hung in Vietnam. I'm familiar with cave systems." He set his phone on the wooden table, still searching for signal. "Let's skip the tourist speech." Miguel's expression remained neutral, though his eyes hardened slightly. "Each cave system has its own dangers, Mr. Kent. Cueva de los Espíritus has claimed 17 lives in my lifetime. 3 were experienced cavers. That's why I paid for the best guide, isn't it?" Alexander replied, glancing around at the modest facility with its worn equipment racks. "When do the others arrive?" 4 other guests will join the expedition," Miguel explained, pointing to the map. "We will explore the main chambers together. The restricted sections," his finger traced a complex network of narrow passages marked with red warning symbols, "are closed for safety and conservation." Alexander leaned over the map, studying the restricted areas with particular interest. "Those are exactly the sections I came to see. The crystal formation chambers are supposed to be extraordinary. Some are unstable, Mr. Kent. The passages shift. Water levels change without warning." Miguel's voice carried the weight of generational knowledge. "My grandfather mapped these tunnels. My father refined the maps. I've spent 40 years learning their secrets." Alexander's phone chirped as it finally connected to the weak signal. He turned away, immediately distracted. "I'm sure it's very impressive. I've got some calls to make before we start. Is there somewhere private I can use?" Miguel watched as Pablo led the wealthy American to the office space. From the doorway, he heard Alexander's voice change to a sharper, executive tone. "Jenkins, I don't care what the board thinks. I'll be off-grid for 72 hours, then we'll continue this discussion." Outside the window, dark clouds gathered over the mountain range housing the ancient cave system. Miguel studied the weather pattern with concern, then turned back to his maps, adding additional notations to the safety briefing he would deliver tomorrow. Whether Alexander Kent would actually listen remained to be seen, but Miguel had a responsibility to try. Some lessons he knew were learned too late. Morning came with the sun's rays beaming across the village's communal lodge windows as Miguel Ortiz laid out the specialized caving equipment with methodical precision. 23 years of guiding experience showed in how he arranged each item in order of use. This included primary headlamps with 300 lumen output, secondary wrist-mounted lights, emergency chemical illumination sticks, 3 types of hand protection for different cave sections, and water-resistant packs containing medical supplies rated for subterranean extraction scenarios. These systems have sustained my family for 3 generations in these caves, Miguel explained, his weathered hands demonstrating proper helmet fitting to the attentive tourists. The labyrinth of Kukulkan demands respect. Its limestone formations took millions of years to develop, but can be destroyed by a single careless touch. Alexander Kent's custom Italian leather boots made hollow sounds against the wooden floor as he paced behind the group, typing furiously on his smartphone. His occasional glances toward the equipment were dismissive, his posture communicating clear impatience. Each headlamp has been tested for 16 hours of continuous operation, Miguel continued, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had led over 500 successful expeditions. You will maintain 2 light sources at all times. If primary illumination fails, immediately activate your secondary system and notify me. Surely that's excessive, Alexander interrupted, finally sliding his $3,000 phone into his jacket pocket. I've done the cenotes in Tulum, Rappelled in Patagonia. Basic spelunking doesn't require military-grade preparation. The other tourists shifted uncomfortably. A middle-aged woman with practical hiking boots exchanged concerned glances with her husband. An Australian backpacker couple leaned forward, showing deliberate attention to Miguel's instructions, in silent rebuke of Alexander's interruption. Miguel's expression remained neutral, a skill developed through years of managing difficult clients in dangerous environments. The Kukulkan system contains 19 known chambers across 7 vertical levels. Temperature drops approximately 1.3 degrees Celsius per 50 meters of depth. Several passages narrow to 40 centimeters in width. I'll take the premium package, Alexander announced, approaching the equipment table. His platinum credit card appeared between manicured fingers. Whatever's top of line. I assume you accept American Express? Miguel nodded toward Maria, his assistant, who handled the transaction while he continued the briefing. The other tourists followed his explanation of emergency protocols with focused attention, practicing the 3-click communication signal used when verbal contact became impossible in the narrower passages. Alexander returned with high-end equipment. A carbon fiber helmet with integrated LED array, technical caving suit, and articulated knee pads that still carried manufacturer tags. He began adjusting the equipment without instruction, ignoring Miguel's standardized fitting procedure. You need proper instruction on the emergency release mechanisms, Miguel said, approaching Alexander with professional concern. The quick release harness requires specific. I've used more complicated systems heli-skiing in the Alps. Alexander dismissed, incorrectly threading the chest strap. Japanese design, right? I recognize the buckle configuration. Miguel firmly placed his hand on the improperly secured harness. Korean manufacturer. Different release pattern. In emergency conditions, incorrect muscle memory can. I've got it. Alexander snapped, pulling away and continuing his self-adjustment. Miguel maintained his professional composure, though his eyes reflected 23 years of having seen how quickly the caves could turn deadly. He returned to the group, demonstrating the specialized breathing technique used in the lower chambers where air quality deteriorated. Listen carefully, Miguel instructed, his tone shifting to one that veteran guides recognized as critical information. The Weeping Chamber contains narrowing passages where several tributaries merge during rainy seasons. Water levels can rise 20 centimeters in under 15 minutes. If you hear the 3-whistle signal, you move immediately toward higher ground. Alexander's voice carried from the back of the room where he was repacking equipment into more aesthetically pleasing arrangements. Is there decent reception down there? My Instagram followers are expecting updates. The Australian woman couldn't contain her disbelief. Mate, he's literally explaining how not to drown. I've swum with sharks in the Galapagos, Alexander replied with practiced confidence. I think I can handle a tourist cave with guardrails. Miguel's expression revealed nothing, but his right hand formed the subtle gesture that local guides recognized. A silent prayer to Kamazotes, the ancient Maya bat god who guarded the entrance to Xibalba, the underworld. The deity who had claimed 11 lives in the caves during Miguel's lifetime alone. We depart in 20 minutes, Miguel announced, his voice carrying the weight of a man who knew exactly what the darkness below could do to the unprepared. The scorching sun cast long shadows across the cave entrance as Miguel gathered the tour group, his weathered hands adjusting the safety harness. With practiced precision, Alexander Kent stood apart from the others, thumbing through emails on his satellite phone, while the guide's instructions washed over him like background noise. 5 tourists had assembled for the descent into Cueva del Espiritu, the legendary cave system that had been in Miguel's family's care for generations. These formations have taken thousands of years to create, Miguel explained, his voice echoing slightly in the cave's mouth. One touch from human hands can destroy centuries of growth. This is why we follow the marked path exactly. His eyes fixed deliberately on Alexander, who barely glanced up from his device. Yeah, don't touch the rocks. Got it, Alexander muttered, finally pocketing his phone and adjusting his premium headlamp, a model that cost more than Miguel made in a month. The other tourists nodded attentively, their expressions showing appropriate reverence. Miguel led them through the entrance chamber, his small flashlight illuminating a path that human feet had traveled for hundreds of years. The temperature dropped noticeably as they moved deeper, the sunlight fading behind them like a distant memory. Alexander pushed past the couple, earning a disapproving glance from Miguel. Please, Setter, we must stay together, Miguel cautioned, his tone firm but respectful. The path ahead narrows, and I've been in caves all over the world, Alexander interrupted, his voice bouncing harshly off the ancient walls. Did a commercial tour of Mammoth Cave last year. This is hardly my first rodeo. He brushed past Miguel, his expensive boots scuffing the carefully preserved path. The first major chamber opened before them, a cathedral of stone draped with delicate formations that seemed to defy gravity itself. Stalactites hung like stone daggers from the ceiling, each one representing thousands of years of patient growth. The group gasped collectively as Miguel directed his light upward, revealing the chamber's full grandeur. Cueva del Espiritu has been sacred to my people since before written history, Miguel explained, genuine passion warming his voice. My grandfather's grandfather guided visitors here, showing them the same formations we see today. Alexander had already wandered to the chamber's edge, his high-powered light sweeping carelessly across fragile formations as he framed photos on his phone. His flash burst through the darkness repeatedly, destroying the careful lighting Miguel had established for the group. Mr. Kent, Miguel called, please remain on the marked path. Those formations are extremely delicate. Just getting a better angle, Alexander replied without turning, stepping over the guide rope and approaching a cluster of pristine crystal formations. You can't expect people to see properly from that tourist trail. The backpacker winced as Alexander's backpack brushed against a centuries-old stalactite. Sir, perhaps you should listen to the guide. These formations are irreplaceable. Alexander rolled his eyes. I'm barely touching anything. Besides, I paid extra for the premium experience. He made air quotes with his fingers, then continued framing his perfect shot. Miguel approached calmly, but firmly. Senator Kent, in this cave, there is no premium path. The same rules protect everyone. The path exists for the cave's protection, not to limit your experience. The group continued deeper, descending through a narrow passage where the walls pressed in close. Miguel pointed out ancient handprints left by his ancestors, faint red ochre marks that had survived millennia. While the group clustered respectfully around these sacred markings, Alexander spotted a glittering vein of crystals in an unmarked side passage. Without hesitation, he slipped away from the group, ducking under another guide rope. His powerful light revealed a tight corridor untouched by the main tour path. "Now this is worth photographing," he muttered, sliding his slim frame into the passage. "Mr. Kent." Miguel's voice carried sharply through the chamber when he noticed the missing tourist. "Please return immediately." Alexander ignored the call, pushing deeper into the side passage where the crystals grew more spectacular. His boots dislodged small stones that clattered into darkness below, suggesting a significant drop. Still, the perfect photo seemed worth the minor risk. When he finally rejoined the group, Miguel's expression had hardened. "Senator, this is your final warning. The deeper chambers are dangerous. If you cannot follow basic safety protocols, I cannot allow you to continue." "Relax," Alexander replied, showing Miguel the spectacular photos on his phone. "Look what your approved path would have made me miss. This is why people pay to come here." Miguel looked at the images and paled slightly. "You entered the crystal chamber. That area has been closed for 15 years due to unstable floor formations. Seemed solid enough to me." Alexander shrugged. The guide took a deep breath, visibly controlling his frustration. "We will now enter the echo chamber. From this point forward, the cave becomes more challenging. There are sections where we must move in a single file. There are passages where the ceiling lowers. Most importantly," he fixed Alexander with an unwavering stare, "there are areas where to step off the path is to risk not just the cave's safety, but your own." Alexander merely checked his watch, unimpressed by what he perceived as exaggerated warnings designed for the average tourist. The cave had yet to show him anything that justified such caution. As the group moved deeper into the earth, the true dangers of Cueva de los Espíritus lay waiting in the darkness ahead. Indifferent to human arrogance or the cost of the equipment carried against them, limestone formations cast eerie shadows across ancient cave walls as Miguel's headlamp swept the chamber, illuminating the junction point where 3 separate tunnels branched from the main cavern. The tour group of 7 had reached the midpoint of their excursion, 400 feet below the surface and nearly a mile from the entrance. Miguel's voice echoed slightly as he addressed the assembled tourists. "This chamber marks our resting point," he explained, his weathered hand indicating the natural stone formations that created convenient seating. 15 minutes only. Drink water, but conserve half your supply for the return journey. Do not under any circumstance venture beyond the illuminated area or enter any of the passages without me." The tourists nodded respectfully, except for Alexander Kent, who was already wandering toward the leftmost passage, his premium headlamp casting a harsh beam across delicate crystal formations. His $3,000 caving outfit gleamed with unused buckles and carabiners, stark contrast to Miguel's worn but functional gear. "Mr. Kent," Miguel called, his voice carrying the weight of 3 generations of cave guides, "please remain with the group. That passage leads to an unstable section we don't include in tours." Alexander's dismissive wave was visible even in the dim light. "Just getting some photos. Better lighting angle from over here." Miguel's jaw tightened as he helped the couple adjust their seating on a smooth stone bench. Years of experience had taught him to recognize warning signs in tourist behavior. And Alexander Kent had been setting off alarm bells since their first meeting 12 hours earlier. "Maria," Miguel instructed his assistant guide, "please keep everyone together while I check the next passage for our continuation." His gaze flickered briefly toward Alexander, who had moved even farther from the group. Maria nodded, understanding the unspoken concern. This was standard protocol for difficult tourists. Maintain group cohesion while the lead guide neutralized potential problems. Miguel approached Alexander with measured steps, his movements practiced from thousands of similar interactions. "Mr. Kent, these formations took approximately 80,000 years to develop. The oils from human skin can permanently damage them. Please stay on the marked path." "I've been in caves across 6 continents," Alexander replied without looking away from his camera's display screen. "I know what I'm doing. These restrictions are for amateur tourists, not experienced adventurers like me." Miguel had encountered this precise attitude 273 times during his 15-year guiding career. It never ended well. Even experienced cavers follow local protocols. "Mr. Kent, it's not just about your safety, it's about preserving the cave system." Alexander finally looked up, his expression barely visible behind his helmet's shield. "I paid triple your standard rate for a private experience. I'm getting my money's worth." Miguel returned to the main group, instructing Maria to begin their routine safety check before continuing. His chronograph showed 7 minutes into their scheduled 15-minute break. Performing the head count, his blood ran cold when he counted only 4 tourists. Alexander Kent was missing. "When did Mr. Kent leave?" Miguel asked, his tone professional despite the spike of adrenaline. 3 minutes ago, Maria replied, already checking her emergency protocols card. "He said he was exploring ahead and would catch up with the amateurs later." Miguel activated his secondary radio system, the one that penetrated deeper into the cave system than standard tourist units. "Base camp, this is Miguel. We have a code yellow. Solo tourists separated at Junction 5. Initiating search protocol." The response came immediately. "Copy, Miguel. Backup team on standby." Standard response or emergency deployment. Miguel's headlamp swept across the 3 passages, noting fresh scuff marks leading into the leftmost tunnel, precisely the one he'd warned Alexander about. The marks showed the distinctive pattern of Alexander's premium alpine boots with their aggressive tread pattern. Standard response for now. "Tourist is well equipped but protocol non-compliant. Will update in 10 minutes. Turning to the group, Miguel's expression remained calm, though his mind raced through the dangers of the left passage, the narrowing corridor that led to the crystal chamber, the unstable floor near the underwater pool, the maze-like network of increasingly tight tunnels beyond. "We have a situation that requires immediate attention. Teresa will lead you to the next scheduled chamber while I locate Mr. Kent." As the tourists murmured with concern, Miguel's light picked up something that made his stomach sink. Alexander's water bottle, dropped carelessly beside the entrance to the Forbidden's Passage, half empty. 6 hours of hydration at most. "Maria, update base camp. Potential code red developing. Mr. Kent has entered the crystal network without water supply." Miguel switched to his high-powered exploration lamp and entered the passage, his movements quick but methodical. 23 years of cave experience told him Alexander Kent had just made a potentially fatal mistake. The path ahead narrowed rapidly, and somewhere in the darkness, a wealthy tourist who believed himself above nature's rules was about to learn how indifferent the ancient cave was to human arrogance. Darkness stretched before Alexander like an ocean, his high-powered headlamp cutting through the blackness, but revealing only more questions, more paths, more decisions. The realization that he was completely lost hit him not all at once, but in waves of increasing panic that he fought to suppress. He wasn't lost. Alexander Kent didn't get lost. He was simply temporarily disoriented. "Ridiculous," he muttered, his voice echoing in the chamber that seemed to grow larger with each passing moment. "I just need to retrace my steps." He pulled his smartphone from his pocket, its sleek design gleaming in the beam of his headlamp. The screen illuminated his face with a blue glow as he opened the GPS app. No signal. Of course there was no signal. He was hundreds of feet underground. Alexander stuffed the useless device back into his pocket, annoyed but not yet worried. He had paid $30,000 for this expedition gear, the best money could buy. The local guide Miguel had looked at his equipment with barely concealed disdain, suggesting he use the specialized gear they provided instead. As if locally sourced equipment could compare to his carbon fiber, military-grade gear. The thought of Miguel made Alexander's jaw tighten. The way the guide had spoken to him, like he was some amateur tourist who needed hand-holding. He was Alexander Kent, for God's sake. He'd climbed Kilimanjaro, rafted the Amazon, and dived the Great Barrier Reef. A simple cave system wasn't going to defeat him. His headlamp suddenly illuminated something that made him forget his irritation. The beam caught a cluster of crystal formations hanging from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls, their surfaces prismatic and untouched. They were unlike anything he'd seen in the main tourist sections. "This is what I paid for," Alexander whispered, reaching for his camera. The formations glittered as he adjusted his lighting, creating a personal light show that no other tourist would capture. This would make the perfect center spread for his travel blog. His followers would go wild as he photographed the crystals. Alexander noticed a narrow opening at the far end of the chamber. His headlamp revealed more crystal formations beyond, even more spectacular than these. The passage looked tight, but navigable. Miguel's warnings about staying on the main path echoed briefly in his mind before being dismissed. "The best discoveries are never on the marked trail," Alexander said to himself, his confidence returning. He'd squeeze through, photograph the formations beyond, and then return the way he came. Simple. The passage was narrower than it had appeared, forcing Alexander to remove his expensive backpack and push it ahead of him. The rough stone scraped against his custom moisture-wicking shirt as he inched forward on his stomach. The tight space should have triggered claustrophobia, but the promise of unseen wonders pulled him forward. "Almost there," he grunted, pushing his backpack through to the other side. The passage widened slightly, allowing him to raise his head. What his headlamp revealed made his breath catch. The chamber beyond was cathedral-like, its ceiling lost in darkness despite his powerful beam. Crystals of impossible size jutted from walls that glistened with moisture. Formations in colors he'd never seen in a cave: amber, pale blue, and something almost purple, created natural sculptures that no human hands could replicate. Alexander forgot about being lost. He forgot about Miguel and the tour group. He forgot everything except capturing these wonders with his camera. He squeezed the rest of the way through the passage, his excitement mounting as he entered the chamber. "This is incredible," he breathed, the words seeming small in the vast space. His voice echoed back to him from multiple directions, creating an eerie chorus of his own amazement. Something shifted behind him. A subtle sound, like stone settling against stone. Alexander turned, his headlamp illuminating the passage he'd just traversed. It looked different, narrower. Had it been that tight when he came through? Just the angle, he assured himself, turning back to the crystal wonderland before him. He'd photograph quickly, then head back. The tour group wouldn't even miss him. He moved deeper into the chamber, each step revealing new wonders. The floor sloped downward, leading him further from the passage, but he barely noticed. His focus was entirely on the formations, each more spectacular than the last. Only when his headlamp caught something moving in the darkness ahead did Alexander pause. There shouldn't be anything moving down here. Miguel had mentioned that this Deep into the system, even bats were rare. He directed his beam toward the movement, but saw only more crystals. His imagination then. The isolation playing tricks on him. Alexander checked his watch. A titanium diving chronometer that had cost more than Miguel probably earned in a year. He'd been separated from the group for almost 40 minutes. Perhaps it was time to head back. He turned, mapping his route back to the narrow passage, when he heard it again. Movement. And this time something else. A sound like water. But not quite. More viscous, flowing. "Hello?" he called, immediately feeling foolish. Nobody else was down here. That was the whole point. He discovered a section of the cave system that the locals either didn't know about or kept secret from tourists. As Alexander approached the passage that was his only way out, his headlamp revealed the truth. What had been a tight but navigable opening was now a mere crack, barely wide enough for his arm. The stone had shifted. "No," he whispered, the sound swallowed by the vastness around him. "That's impossible." But the evidence was before him, undeniable. In the harsh light of his headlamp, the way back was closed. And something in the chamber with him was moving, drawing closer with each passing moment. Alexander Kent, who had dismissed Miguel's warnings, ignored safety protocols, and wandered from the path, finally understood. He wasn't a discoverer. He was trapped, alone in the dark, with no one knowing where to find him. And something else was in the darkness with him. Passage narrowed without warning as Alexander pushed forward, his shoulders suddenly scraping against rough limestone on both sides. His first instinct was annoyance rather than fear, another inconvenience in what was becoming an increasingly frustrating detour. The beam of his premium tactical flashlight illuminated the path ahead, revealing a tunnel that tapered to a size that would require careful navigation. "Just need to squeeze through here," he muttered to himself, the sound of his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Then I'll double back and find the main path." Alexander twisted his body sideways, attempting to slide through the narrowest section. His designer hiking jacket caught on a jagged outcropping, tearing slightly as he pushed forward. The $500 garment was the least of his concerns now, though the thought of its damage annoyed him. He'd been recording the experience on his phone, documenting what he planned to describe later as his independent exploration of the cave system. The limestone pressed harder against his chest as he forced himself forward, exhaling completely to reduce his size. A sudden shift in the rock, imperceptible but catastrophic, reduced the passage width by crucial millimeters. Alexander felt the pressure increase instantly, his movement halting mid-push. What the hell? He tried to push forward again, but his body refused to move. The initial irritation quickly transformed into concern as he attempted to reverse direction, only to find himself equally immobile in that direction as well. The realization struck with horrifying clarity. He was stuck. "This isn't happening," Alexander said, his voice now betraying the first tremors of fear. He tried again to push forward, straining with all his strength. The unyielding rock face responded by scraping layers of skin from his hands, drawing blood that appeared black in the artificial light. His breathing quickened, each rapid inhalation further restricting his movement as his chest expanded against the stone. The expensive backpack, filled with premium equipment that Miguel had deemed unnecessary, now pressed painfully against his spine, wedging him tighter into the passage. "Help!" he shouted, the sound bouncing back at him mockingly. "Can anyone hear me?" Only the distant drip of water answered his call. Alexander fumbled with shaking hands for his phone, nearly dropping it into the darkness below. The screen's glow illuminated his face, the sweat now pouring freely down his forehead. No signal. Of course there was no signal. Miguel had mentioned this specifically during the briefing Alexander had barely listened to. "Your communication devices won't work once we're below 50 meters, the guide had explained. The rock blocks all signals. We use specialized radio equipment that Alexander had cut him off then, making a joke about upgrading from stone. Age technology. The memory now felt like another cruel joke, one he'd played on himself. A sudden movement sent his tactical flashlight tumbling from its precarious position on a nearby rock ledge. Alexander watched in horror as his $200 light bounced once, twice, then disappeared into the darkness below, the beam swinging wildly before vanishing completely. The darkness that enveloped him was absolute, a blackness so complete it seemed to have physical weight. The only light now came from his phone screen, which warned him that battery life had dropped to 18%. "This can't be happening," Alexander whispered, his voice small in the vast darkness. He tried again to free himself, twisting violently against the stone. The movement caused his phone to slip from his sweating hands. He lunged desperately to catch it, but succeeded only in wedging himself more firmly into the narrow passage. The phone clattered somewhere below, its screen still illuminated, but now facing away from him, casting eerie shadows that revealed nothing useful. The weight of the mountain above him seemed to press down with increasing force as claustrophobia took hold. Alexander felt his chest constricting, each breath becoming more difficult than the last. The premium moisture-wicking fabric of his hiking shirt now clung to his body, soaked with sweat despite the cave's cool temperature. "I just need to calm down," he told himself, trying to control his breathing. "Miguel and the others will notice I'm missing. They'll come looking." But even as he spoke the words, Alexander remembered how he'd deliberately separated from the group, how he'd mocked Miguel's insistence on staying together. "I've hiked the Himalayas," he'd boasted earlier. "I think I can handle a tourist cave." The guide's response came back to him now with cruel clarity. "Senor, this is not a tourist cave. This is one of nature's oldest death traps for the unprepared." Something skittered across Alexander's exposed hand, something small with far too many legs. He jerked reflexively, scraping another layer of skin from his shoulder. The panic he'd been fighting surged forward, overwhelming his attempts at rational thought. "Help!" he screamed, the sound deafening in the confined space. "Somebody help me!" Only echoes answered as the darkness pressed closer, his phone screen dimmed to conserve battery, and the first drops of water began to fall on his face from somewhere. In the blackness above, time loses all meaning in the pitch blackness of limestone. Prison walls. Alexander Kent's breathing echoes shallow and rapid, each exhale bouncing back from the rock face just inches from his nose. 18 hours trapped. According to his $12,000 watch, the luminous dial now his only light source. Since dropping his primary flashlight into the unseen void below. "Hello, hello." His voice cracks, desperation stripping away the corporate polish. The sound travels perhaps 50 feet before the cave swallows it completely. No response. Never any response. His left leg lost sensation 6 hours ago. Pinned at an unnatural angle where the passage narrowed unexpectedly. The expensive moisture-wicking hiking pants, purchased but never properly tested, now soaked with sweat and urine. Core temperature drops steadily as hypothermia begins its silent advance. Alexander's mind fragments in the darkness. Hallucinations creep in from the periphery of his vision. Movement where nothing should move. Whispers where only dripping water exists. His Princeton-educated brain, once capable of calculating complex market projections, now cannot determine which shadows are real and which are manufactured by his oxygen-deprived consciousness. "I'll pay ... anything," he whispers to the void, the statement automatic, reflexive, currency being his default solution. But the ancient limestone offers no negotiation, no corporate be-out option. The cave system existed for millennia before him and will remain long after his body becomes part of its ecosystem. A skittering sound from somewhere to his right. Real or imagined? His breath catches. Miguel was right, Alexander admits to the darkness, the first authentic statement he's made since entering the cave system. The guide's warnings replay in his mind with cruel clarity. The specific instructions about staying with the group. The detailed explanation of how limestone passages can shift without warning. The demonstrated technique for traversing narrow gaps without becoming wedged. His phone battery shows 8% remaining. The screen's harsh blue light illuminates his prison cell for precisely 3 seconds before he shuts it off, preserving what little power remains. No signal hadn't been since entering the outer chambers. The $1,400 smartphone with satellite capabilities rendered useless by 300 feet of solid rock. In this moment, he would trade his entire tech portfolio for a simple whistle like Miguel had issued to each tourist. The whistle he had mockingly left behind at the entrance. Water drips somewhere nearby. Dehydration tightens his throat despite the maddening sound of inaccessible moisture. Thirst becomes another torturer in his limestone cell. Something touches his face. Alexander screams, the sound primal and unrestrained. His hand swipes frantically at his cheek, connecting with something small and multi-legged. Cave life. Residents adapted to permanent darkness across countless generations. He imagines more creatures approaching, drawn to his body heat, his sweat. His blood where skin has torn against rock. "I'm sorry," he whispers, unsure who he's addressing. Miguel, the other tourists, his assistant who warned him about booking this authentic experience, or perhaps the cave itself. The apology dissolves into quiet sobbing. A sound reaches him from deep in the cave system, a low, sonorous rumble. Shifting rock. The living mountain adjusted its posture by millimeters, enough to further compress his trapped leg. Fresh pain shoots through the limb he thought was beyond feeling. Alexander activates his phone one final time. Battery, 6%. No signal. The screen's light reveals tiny white creatures scurrying away from the sudden brightness. Cave-adapted arthropods, eyeless and pale. He opens the video recording app and props the phone against a rock wall, his hands shaking uncontrollably. "My name is Alexander Kent, if anyone finds this." His voice breaks. "I should have listened. To anyone who's watching, listen to your guides. Listen to the people who know. I didn't, and now." The passage creaks again, shifting, tightening. The phone dies, plunging him back into perfect darkness. Alexander Kent, CEO of Venture Tech Solutions, whose schedule was booked 8 months in advance for 15-minute meetings, now has nothing but time and darkness. The cave's eternal patience surrounds him, unimpressed by his resume, his bank accounts, or his desperate pleas. In the distance, too faint to provide hope, comes the echo of voices. The search continues, but in which direction? In the perfect darkness, Alexander Kent loses the last fragments of his carefully constructed identity, reduced to nothing more than a frightened animal trapped in a hole in the ground. Darkness wrapped around him like a living shroud, the absolute blackness penetrating beyond his eyes and into his mind. 43 hours trapped in the narrow limestone passage had transformed the once confident tech executive into something barely recognizable. His expensive moisture-wicking shirt now clung to his body, soaked with sweat despite the cave's 52-degree temperature. Hypothermia had set in 18 hours ago, his core temperature dropping steadily as the unforgiving rock leached heat from his immobilized body. "Status check," Alexander whispered to himself, his voice cracking from dehydration. The ritual, borrowed from some half-remembered survival show, had become his anchor to sanity. Water gone. Phone at 2%. Left arm numb from shoulder down. Right leg. He paused, realizing he could no longer feel anything below his knee. Right leg non-responsive. The $8,000 custom-designed headlamp he'd bragged about to the other tourists had failed hours ago, its battery depleted after he'd ignored Miguel's instructions about conserving power. Now only the dim glow of his dying smartphone provided any illumination, casting grotesque shadows across the glistening cave walls. Something scurried across his outstretched hand. Alexander jerked involuntarily, triggering a cascade of pain through his compressed chest. Cave crickets. Or perhaps something worse. Miguel had mentioned specialized predators that had evolved in the darkness over millions of years. Creatures that had never seen light, hunting by vibration and scent. They're just looking for food. Miguel had explained during the orientation that Alexander had mostly ignored, distracted by emails on his phone. They won't bother you if you respect their home. Respect. The concept seemed like it belonged to another lifetime now. Alexander had arrived at the village with the same attitude he brought to corporate acquisitions, a sense that everything could be purchased, controlled, conquered. The locals with their weathered hands and simple clothes had seemed like props in his adventure vacation, their warnings quaint superstitions rather than generations of hard-earned wisdom. A distant dripping echoed through the passage, each drop marking seconds that stretched into eternity. Alexander's breathing had become shallow, his ribs unable to fully expand in the narrowing crevice. The passage wasn't getting smaller. His body was swelling from the pressure and lack of circulation. "Critical system failure," he whispered, a bitter laugh escaping his cracked lips. How many startup CEOs had he watched collapse under pressure? Their companies failing because they wouldn't listen to industry veterans? Now he was experiencing his own system failure, his body shutting down while his mind fragmented. His phone chirped. 1% battery remaining. With trembling fingers, Alexander opened the voice recorder. His previous attempts to call for help had failed. No signal penetrated this deep into the earth. Instead, he'd begun recording final messages to his parents, his sister, his executive team. Each message had started composed, professional, but deteriorated as his condition worsened. "This is ... His voice caught, a sob threatening to break through. "This is my final recording. I don't think I'm going to make it out. Miguel, if you find this, I'm sorry I didn't listen. You tried to tell me." He paused, gathering what remained of his strength. "To whoever finds me, please tell my family I understand now. The cave doesn't care about your stock options or your vacation homes. Nature doesn't negotiate." More movement in the darkness. Something larger this time, its presence felt rather than seen. The cave system had its own ecosystem, Miguel had explained. Cave fish, specialized amphibians, blind salamanders hunting in eternal night. Alexander's mind conjured images of pale, eyeless creatures sensing his weakening body, waiting for their opportunity. Were they real or hallucinations? After nearly 2 days without water, his mind could no longer distinguish between reality and nightmare. The phone screen dimmed automatically to conserve power. Alexander tapped it desperately, needing the light more than the ability to record. The screen brightened momentarily, then went black as the battery finally died. Total darkness engulfed him. A primal sound escaped his throat, something between a whimper and a scream. In the boardroom, Alexander had always been the predator, circling weaker companies, looking for vulnerabilities. Now he understood what it meant to be prey. His body temperature continued to drop, the cold rock drawing away his remaining warmth. The hypothermia was almost a mercy now, numbing the pain, clouding his thoughts with a strange sense of peace. Somewhere in the recesses of his educated mind, Alexander knew this was the end stage. His body is shutting down, preparing for the inevitable. Miguel was right, he whispered to the darkness, his words falling into the void. I should have listened. More scurrying sounds, closer now. The cave's inhabitants grew bolder as they sensed his weakening condition. Alexander's breaths came in shallow gasps, each one more difficult than the last. The weight of the mountain above pressed down, 1 billion tons of indifferent stone that had existed long before humans and would remain long after dot in the perfect darkness. Alexander Kent, who had once commanded boardrooms and moved markets, with his decisions finally understood the bitter reality of his insignificance. The mountain didn't surrender its secrets easily. Miguel had learned that lesson from his grandfather and his father before him. 3 generations of cave guides had mapped the ancient system's twisted pathways, but the darkness always held surprises. 60 hours into the search for Alexander Kent, Miguel's weathered face showed no exhaustion, only grim determination, as he led the specialized rescue team through a narrow passage barely wider than his shoulders. Readings dropping again. Sarah Martinez, the team's technical specialist, reported through the radio, her voice crackling in the compressed air. Oxygen's down to 17% in the lower chamber. We've got maybe 4 hours before it becomes critical. Miguel nodded, his headlamp illuminating centuries-old stalactites that hung like ancient daggers. The cave system was fighting them, as it always fought intrusion. Seasonal rains had raised the water table, flooding passages that had been open. Just 3 days ago, when the arrogant American had wandered off, ignoring every warning, every marker. "We found something," Carlos called from 20 meters ahead, his voice echoing through the limestone corridor. "Designer water bottle. Has to be his." Miguel moved forward, carefully testing each step with his walking stick. Unlike Alexander Kent's $300 hiking boots that had left distinct prints in the soft clay, Miguel wore simple rubber-soled shoes his father had designed specifically for these caves. The rescue team followed in single file, their movements economical, conserving energy and oxygen. "He went through here," Miguel said, examining scuff marks on a narrow ledge. "The fool took the crystal path, even after I specifically told everyone. It was forbidden." The rescue coordinator's voice crackled through their headsets. "Any sign of response to the acoustic signals?" "Negative," Sarah replied, checking her equipment. "But these formations could be muffling the sound. If he's conscious, he might not hear us until we're right on top of him." The passage widened into Cathedral Chamber, an enormous cavern where ghostly white formations had grown undisturbed for millennia. Under different circumstances, the beauty would have been breathtaking. Now it only represented more ground to search, more places where a man could be dying alone in the dark. "Split into pairs," Miguel ordered, pointing to different sections of the chamber. "Remember, this man has no training, no experience. Look for the obvious path, the one with the most visual appeal. That's where he would go." The rescue team deployed with practiced efficiency, unlike the haphazard local volunteers who had initially responded. This specialized unit had been airlifted in from the capital at the insistence of Alexander's company. Ironically, the same man who had dismissed local knowledge now depended entirely on it for his survival. Temperatures dropping, Sarah noted, checking her thermometer. "We're getting close to the water table." Miguel paused, listening to the cave. His grandfather had taught him that the mountain spoke to those who knew how to listen. The faint drip of water, the subtle movement of air, the way sound traveled through different passages, all told stories if you understood the language. "This way," he said suddenly, changing direction toward a downward sloping tunnel that many would have missed. "The air feels different here." Dr. Reyes, the medical specialist, kept pace beside him. "If he's been trapped for 60 hours, we're looking at severe dehydration, hypothermia, possible crush syndrome if he's been wedged in a tight space." Miguel nodded grimly. "And the psychological effects, the darkness, it does things to unprepared minds." They moved deeper, each minute stretching the boundaries of hope. The cave system contained over 80 kilometers of mapped passages, with countless unmapped sections that only local guides knew about. Finding one man in this labyrinth should have been impossible. "Look!" Carlos's voice echoed from ahead. "Fresh scratch marks on the wall. Someone's been through here recently." Miguel examined the marks, his experienced eyes reading the story. They told. He was desperate here, trying to widen the passage. These are fingernail marks. The team moved forward with renewed urgency, following the trail of a man's desperate struggle. Miguel's light caught something reflective ahead, the buckle from an expensive camera bag, abandoned where the passage narrowed. "He's close," Miguel whispered, a strange mix of vindication and concern in his voice. The passage ahead narrows severely. This is where he would have gotten stuck. Sarah's equipment suddenly registered a faint heat signature. "We've got something. 2 o'clock, 30 meters ahead." The rescue team surged forward, lights converging on a narrow fissure where the cave seemed to swallow itself. And there, wedged, at an impossible angle, was Alexander Kent, unmoving, eyes closed, his once expensive clothing now tattered and soiled. Miguel reached him first, pressing fingers against his neck. "He's alive," he announced, his voice betraying no emotion. Barely. The cave had not claimed another victim. Not today. Beeping medical equipment cut through the silence as Alexander Kent opened his eyes for the first time in 3 days. Fluorescent hospital lights assaulted his vision, a shocking contrast to the absolute darkness that had nearly consumed him. 64 hours since he'd squeezed into that passage. 64 hours that had fundamentally altered everything he'd once believed about himself. "He's awake," a nurse called out, her voice seeming unnaturally loud to his hypersensitive ears. The cave had changed his relationship with sound, the dripping water, the skittering of unseen creatures, his own increasingly desperate breathing, all permanently etched into his consciousness. Dr. Rivera approached the bed, checking vitals with practiced efficiency. "Mr. Kent, you're at Regional Medical Center. You've been unconscious since your extraction from the cave system." Alexander tried to speak, but his throat felt like sandpaper. After sipping water through a straw, he managed to ask a single question. "Miguel, the guide who saved your life?" Dr. Rivera raised an eyebrow. "He's been here every day checking on you, unlike the reporters camping outside." The door opened, and Miguel entered, his weathered face showing fatigue but relief. Gone was the deferential posture he'd shown when Alexander had first arrived at the village. He stood now with the quiet confidence of someone whose expertise had been vindicated in the most dramatic way possible. "The famous Alexander Kent returns to the world of light," Miguel said, approaching the bed. "The cave decided to spare you after all." Alexander's eyes filled with unexpected tears. "I should be dead." "Yes," Miguel nodded matter-of-factly. "By all normal outcomes, you should be. The passage where we found you, we call it La Garganta, or the throat. It has taken others before you." Images flashed through Alexander's mind. The tightening walls, the moment when his chest couldn't expand enough to take a full breath, the absolute darkness when his light failed, the crawling things he'd felt but couldn't see. "The rescue team had to remove part of the rock face," Miguel continued. "It took 11 hours of careful work. Any vibration risked bringing down the whole passage on you. The village sent 20 men. Everyone helped." Alexander's phone sat on the bedside table. Dr. Rivera noticed his glance. "It's been ringing constantly. Your assistant, your company board, news networks. CNN aired footage of your rescue." "Footage?" Miguel nodded. "One of the rescue team recorded it. You've become somewhat famous. The American executive who ignored every warning and had to be saved by the very people whose expertise he dismissed." Alexander closed his eyes, remembering the recorded messages he'd left as he thought he was dying. The confessions, the regrets, the desperate pleas for forgiveness. "Your last video," Miguel said quietly. "It went viral." Alexander's eyes snapped open. "What?" "Someone from the rescue team leaked it," Dr. Rivera explained uncomfortably. "Your phone was recovered before you were. The final video message. It's gotten over 30 million views." The memory crashed over him, recording himself in those final hours, delirious from dehydration and fear, sobbing as he admitted how his arrogance had brought him to this end, begging forgiveness from all those he'd belittled, including Miguel. "By name, I'm sorry," Alexander whispered, the words feeling wholly inadequate. Miguel's expression softened slightly. "Our village has received donations from around the world since your video spread. Enough to build the proper training center. For our guides that we've needed for generations, your experience has brought unexpected blessings." 3 days later, Alexander sat in a wheelchair for his first press conference, still too weak to stand. His normally perfectly groomed appearance replaced by a gaunt face, haunted eyes, and hospital gown. His company's PR team had prepared a statement, but he set it aside when he reached the microphones. "I went into that cave believing my wealth and technology made me superior to the local knowledge that had been passed down for generations," he began, his voice still raspy. "I dismissed Miguel's warnings because I couldn't imagine that someone from such a primitive village could know something I didn't." Camera flashes illuminated his face as he continued. "I was hours from death when they found me. The rescue team risked their lives because of my arrogance. What I experienced in that darkness... He paused, fighting unexpected emotion. It fundamentally changed me." In the back of the room, Miguel stood with several members of his village, watching silently. "My foundation is establishing a permanent endowment for the preservation of indigenous knowledge, starting with the Cave System Conservation and Guide Training Center in Miguel's village. We will fund similar programs globally, recognizing that wisdom doesn't come from technology or wealth, but from generations of lived experience." Later, as the media dispersed, Miguel approached Alexander's wheelchair. "You understand now, Miguel," said simply, "what the darkness teaches." Alexander nodded, the cave's absolute blackness still living behind his eyelids whenever he closed them. "I do, though I paid a higher price for the lesson than I would have recommended." "The cave chooses the tuition," Miguel replied with the hint of a smile. "But the education is always worth it." Alexander extended his hand, not as the wealthy tourist to the local guide, but as one man to another. "Thank you for finding me, despite my best efforts to get myself killed." Miguel clasped his hand firmly. "Remember what you learned in the darkness, Alexander Kent. It will serve you better than anything you knew in the light." As Miguel turned to leave, Alexander called after him, "The cave system. I'd like to visit it again someday." Miguel paused, surprise crossing his features. Many who have been trapped never wish to return. "I need to," Alexander said simply. "But next time, I'll listen to every word you say." For the first time, Miguel's face broke into a genuine smile. "Then perhaps there is hope for you yet." The night before leaving the village, Alexander stood outside the hospital, looking up at the stars. The doctors had warned about the psychological after effects. Claustrophobia, night terrors, panic attacks, all are common after such trauma. But standing under the vast open sky, Alexander felt something unexpected. Gratitude. The darkness had stripped away everything he'd once used to define himself. Wealth, status, technology, control, and left him with a truth he'd spent his entire life avoiding, that he was as vulnerable and dependent as any other human being. It was a lesson written in fear and sealed in darkness, but one he would never forget. Tomorrow he would return to his world of boardrooms and tech innovations, but part of him would always remain in that crushing passage, forever changed by what he'd learned when all the lights went out.